in this very unique neighborhood. There's an extraordinary history of characters and titans. I just think that our own stories are exciting. They tell us who we are, who we've been, and they just give us a sense of where we might go because we have precedent. And it's not precedent that we've imported from somewhere else. The people came from somewhere else, but they made their stories here.
The pianos that Theodore Heintzman and his sons built are found across Canada, and they really have a lot of value to Canadians, and especially in the time period when they were produced.
Heintzman pianos were designed to last a long time, designed to hold a tune a long time, and designed to look good for a long time, and designed to sound and play well for a very long time.
One of the things that I think has been really valuable for me is seeing how my relatives actually had a big role in Canadian history.
The 1848, 49, 50 was a time of intense turmoil. I mean, a whole bunch of wars running around Europe. And my great-great-grandfather brought the family to New York. One of the legends is that he was on the same boat with Steinway. It is not clear.
They moved from there to Buffalo. Now, they came over to New York City in 1850, and then a year later moved to Buffalo. And they stayed in Buffalo almost 10 years before going to Toronto in 1860, where he actually, according to family legend, built his first piano in his daughter's kitchen. There's no evidence to prove or disprove that story, but it's been told for generations. She and her husband lived in Toronto, and that was actually why Theodore came to Toronto in the first place. The two of them actually financed the beginning of Theodore Heintzman's company.
And a lot of things were happening in Canada at that time. It was a very dynamic period for Canada. The time of scratching out clearing the land and some of the very significant hardship that happened in the early part of the 1800s was past. And so there was a little bit of extra income. So the piano was sort of the source of entertainment.
In schools, music was much more widely taught than it is now, and the piano was the instrument of choice to accompany choirs, ensembles of any type. To play music and to play the piano well was considered a very fine accomplishment in Victorian society. Then he set up shop on York Street, and the company at that point employed actually 4 craftsmen, aside from Theodore himself, one of which was his grandson. And the company stayed there for several years, and then a new factory at King Street was built. And that factory actually remained the sole factory of the company until the Toronto Junction factory was built in 1888.
Certainly, the Junction is a unique place, and it has a kind of cultural memory that really is based on the time that the Heintzmans arrived. And the Heintzman story is in many ways the Junction story. Well, the Heintzmans arrive in 1888 to 1889, which is an absolutely key period because it was in 1888 that the Junction incorporates as a village, and in 1889 that it incorporates as a town, which also gives you a sense of how rapid this boom was. And the factory was just up the street from Keele and Dundas, which was really the hub of the Junction at that time. So they would have been just around the corner from the Junction College of Music, from the Molson's Bank, and from the White Swan Tavern, which kind of gives you a range of the attractions that the town would have had to offer.
The Junction was where everything came together. So all of the cattle came in to Toronto there. The stockyards and the slaughterhouses were just down the street.
There was no sewers, so it was a backyard sewage situation, muddy streets and plank sidewalks.
There were 3 railways that all came together there. And then they put a pumping station down in Swansea to bring the water up for the railway, because steam engines took a lot of water.
The railway was creating boom times right across the country, and the Junction was very much one of the key ones because so many of the railway came here. The railway itself would have been the prime attraction for the Heintzmans, but Clendenin was offering businesses a low tax rate and free water.
So once you have a piano factory at the junction of a train station, and you have water and the trains can bring you coal, and all of the farmland that's being cleared in southern Ontario gave you huge amounts of extremely good wood. So you wanted the maple for the backing and the soundboard, you wanted the spruce for the soundboard itself, and the walnuts. All those very high quality, large old growth trees were all being cut down to make farmland and could come in by train from all over southern Ontario. So all of the raw materials came in more easily, and the pianos could go out more easily.
When Theodore Heintzman started making his pianos, the piano didn't really fit with the living room Canadian home at that time, because a lot of the pianos that were made were box-like structures. They would be plain wood, and one of the things that Theodore was an expert at was creating amazing cabinetry. And in many cases, you can see the music desks of his pianos, the very early Heintzmans, are so ornate. And that really made it a lot more appealing as something that Canadians really wanted in their homes.
It was by far the most expensive. The Heintzman Piano Company was much more profitable than any of the other piano companies, of which there's something like 134 different piano companies at that time.
When Theodore came over, there were lots of craftsmen coming over from Germany and other places in Europe that were building pianos in Canada in all different places.
My great-great-grandfather was aiming at the top end of the market. He wanted pianos that sounded better and were easier to play than anybody else's pianos, and that's how he sold them.
Everything had to be just right for him, and he was very particular about that. And that really sets the stage for the rest of the company. He patented several very important developments to the piano. The most important one of those was the agrafe bridge, which was a special type of bridge for the piano that held the strings in place more firmly and therefore kept the piano in tune better.
There was sort of 2 waves of patents. All of the things my great-great-grandfather was interested in was making the instrument more rigid and making the strings hold their tension for a longer period of time so they didn't need as much tuning. The patents of my grandfather dealt more with the action. So the 2 parts of the sound is how you hit the string and how you hold the string and put that in the case and have this whole sound box give you a nice sound.
George Charles Heintzman, of the 4 sons of Theodore, definitely had the most involvement in the company. He took over the presidency after his father's death, and he was the visionary of the Heintzman family.
At age 15, he seems to have gone off to the States to work for various people, learning different aspects of business. One of the stories is that he worked for Steinway. I don't know whether that's true or verifiable. So that when he came back, he knew every aspect of the business.
He was the showman of the company. He created history by riding the first transcontinental train, playing the piano from one end of the country to the other.
He also would accompany different artists around and meet them and sign them as being Heintzman artists, and then supply them with Heintzman pianos and a tuner wherever they went.
He also exhibited the pianos at various exhibitions.
Sometimes it was done with newspaper ads, but it was continual advertising.
He really helped to keep the company alive through the Great Depression. He realized the need to diversify, and so the company sold all sorts of things then, whiteware as it was called, but fridges, stoves, coffee makers, just about everything you can think of was sold in these Heintzman Company stores. And that really helped the company during the Great Depression. My favorite story is about his trip to England for the Colonial and Indian exhibition. He went to this exhibition and there were lots of other piano builders there. They were all instructed to stand nicely beside their pianos as the Queen passed by. And all of them did so, except for George. As soon as the Queen was coming down the aisle towards his piano, he whipped down to the bench and began to play. And the Queen was heard to remark, "We didn't realize that such beautiful instruments could be made in the colonies." And George was, of course, invited to tea the next day. And arrangements were later made for a piano to be placed at Royal Albert Hall.
And legend also tells us that he rode the cowcatcher coming into Vancouver handing out leaflets, which is not impossible because Lady Agnes MacDonald had ridden the cowcatcher coming through the Rockies, so it might have been a vogue at that time.
Well, one of the stories, apocryphal or otherwise, I don't know, is that one of the chief salesmen in Ontario would travel around with a driver and a piano tuner and a piano. And unfortunately, pretty well every night it would break down near the wealthiest farmer in the neighborhood. And he would go and ask him for help. And invariably the chap would invite him for the night and they would unload the piano and he would play for them. And 9 times out of 10, the piano stayed in the house.
One of the reasons that they could do that was because the company had arranged that they would accept all sorts of things in exchange for these pianos. So they would accept cows and horses in some cases in exchange for a piano. There's a tale of a cow ending up at the Junction factory in exchange for one of these pianos and not having a very good time of it because the workers didn't really know how to take care of this cow. When they built the Toronto Junction factory, even though it was a large factory and employed a large number of workers, these workers were all craftsmen in their own right. This was a factory where hand tools were used, old methods of manufacturing were prevalent, and they really took pride in their artistry and creativity.
The plant would have been built to run on steam, and these steam engines would have driven long transmission shafts, and all of the equipment would have run off of those shafts. But any hand tools would still be run by hand. This was passed down, and I'm sure it came from the factory. It was passed down by my father to me, and this would have had a string around it. You'll notice the drill is not, it's just a two-directional drill because it goes back and forth. It's not a spiral drill like we would have today. The chuck is relatively simple. And that really didn't change for a long time. And they made a lot of their own tools. For example, my father left me this tool, and if you look at it, you can see that it's made from a file that somebody has run taken off the rough edges, and they've ground it down and fitted on a hammer and put a piece of brass on it. And it's very hard steel because it's a file. And if you feel it, it keeps a good edge.
The story has been told that several of the congregants here worked at the Heintzman factory. They're reported to have built all these spindles, as you see here and up above in the balcony. I guess maybe there's some truth to the story that the Heintzman's factory played a major role in the construction of the synagogue.
Certainly the community on Mariah Street has great memories of the members of their family that were Heintzman craftsmen and employees, and there's a great fondness for the Heintzman legacy in that community.
There was a lot of effort by the employer to foster that concept of community. They had people compose marches and waltzes that were played at the company picnics.
There's 2 of each of those, and they were reportedly on one of Theodore's birthdays. The Heintzman company got together a band, and they played this piece around his house on his birthday.
They had company picnics, they had company baseball teams, and those kinds of things to foster a sense of family in the plant. In terms of where the pianos were sold, a few were shipped to England, a few were shipped to the United States. The big expansion of the piano company was from Newfoundland to Victoria.
By the 1960s, the piano was no longer so important in the homes. So business was declining, and there was a lot of competition from Asian and US piano marketers that were able to produce pianos much more cheaply. The company continued to produce their grand pianos at the Junction factory until 1977. But the reason for the move of most of the piano manufacturing from the Junction was actually due to the establishment of Edward Baker as president in 1956. He took over from George Bradford Heintzman, and he was the first president of the company who was not of the Heintzman family. And he built the new factory at Hanover, Ontario in 1962. And that factory produced all of the upright pianos for the Heintzman company.
I had 2 visits to the piano factory, one in the old factory and one in the new factory. My recollection of the previous factory is that it was probably very close to its original design. It was on 3 floors. The new factory was all on 1 floor. The new factory was built around electricity. The old factory had big pots of glue that smelled. There was a lot of sawdust. There was a lot of handwork, planing and putting veneers into presses and things all tightened by hand. I don't think anybody had really rethought how to make a piano. And I think that's the kind of thinking that needed to be done if you were going to compete with people who had that kind of strength.
The quality of the piano, I think, began to deteriorate as soon as Baker became president, particularly because he chose to begin building a new apartment-sized piano. This was something that had been called for many years by the public, and George Bradford Heintzman, his predecessor, had refused to build it because he thought it would be too much of a compromise on quality.
In the 1970s, trucks had replaced the railway as the most economic way of moving things. Also, higher taxes and congestion were pushing factories out of the downtown core. On the other hand, they were being drawn to places like Hanover because there was a greater supply of hardwood available to them. Also, there were carpenters there who were working in related industries who were already available.
There was a lot of financial difficulty within the company after Baker's presidency. The company did merge with Sherlock Manning, and later it did close because there was not enough demand for these instruments at that time. By 1978, there were no more piano manufacturers in Canada. legacy of the Heintzman family is their pianos. They're found all across Canada, still today. Many of them are over 100 years old, but they're still being played in homes, churches, and schools all across the country.
Architecturally, the Heintzman family, particularly through the Birches, Theodore Heintzman's home, contributed greatly to the streetscape and the iconic nature of the town. There is a major condominium development with a population probably akin to what the Junctions was as a town. We're very happy that, that it was the population of the condominium that voted to name the Heintzman place after the Heintzmans.
Well, I would like to see the Heintzman name always stand for quality. You should do things and do them well. I hope that lots of people feel that way. It's not unique to our family.
When we look at the Heintzman story, it seems we see a family and a company that's dedicated to the quality of their product and the quality of life. And that's a great legacy.